I'm Bonnie Faulkner. Today on Guns and Butter, Indira Singh. Indira Singh has been working on Wall Street since 1975. On 9/11, she was working as a senior consultant for J.P. Morgan Chase. She was tasked with developing a next-generation operational risk blueprint which would proactively identify exposures, including money laundering, rogue trading, and illicit financing patterns. It was in this capacity 9 months later she became aware of the biggest threat to our country, a transnationally protected terrorist cartel that brought us 9/11. Indira Singh is a private pilot and a climber. Prior to 9/11, she volunteered as a civilian emergency medical technician until she was injured at Ground Zero. Indira Singh, welcome.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Indira, where were you on September 11th, 2001? You were living in New York City, weren't you?
Yes, I was living and working in Lower Manhattan, a couple hundred yards away from the World Trade Center. My apartment was southwest of the site, and I worked on Wall Street for J.P. Morgan Chase.
Now, where were you on that very morning of September 11th? Were you at home? Were you at work?
That morning, I was at home. I was late. I was supposed to have attended a risk conference that was being held on the 106th floor of the World Trade Center at the North Tower. And for some reason, I woke up late and didn't make it there. So when the first plane hit, I was actually on my way out in a business suit. And I turned back, changed into my EMT clothes. I was a civilian emergency medical technician, New York State, and the second plane hit, and I basically went down to the site from that point on. So were your offices actually in the World Trade Center? No, they weren't. They were on Wall Street itself, and there were offices that I consulted in all around the World Trade Center, but the only reason I would have been there that morning was the risk technology seminar. Risk Waters had basically they invited people from all over the world, all over the country. And there were close to 100 delegates already assembled when the first plane hit. No one made it off the 106th floor.
And that was a meeting that you were scheduled to be in and you were simply late?
I was late, yeah.
Indira, what's an emergency medical technician, and how did you become an EMT?
Well, I was pre-med for many years and before I went into technology, but I was basically a mountain climber. I traveled to Asia many times, and when you indulge in these activities, pretty risky activities, in remote areas, someone ought to know how to, for instance, set a broken leg or take care of medical emergencies. That part of the world is itself beset with terrorist attacks. I frequently saw the results of violence or just, serious accidents, buses falling over into a ravine. So about 4 or 5 years prior to 9/11, I decided to get licensed so I would know what to do in case of an emergency. And in New York City, because it's so dense with hospitals, there are not many volunteer ambulance corps, but I did belong to one in Brooklyn. I rode a bus and ambulance pretty much every Friday night whenever I could. So I was licensed. And so the rules are that in a multi-casualty incident, especially the one the size of the World Trade Center attack, it's all hands on deck.
So you were in a business suit on the street, actually, then, when the first plane hit the first tower?
Yes. And I went back. Actually, I was on my way out of my building, technically, and I went back and changed into my EMT clothes, and I remember that being very much in slow motion and trying to assemble my jump kit. I went back again for burn sheets because we knew, it was an airplane incident. A lot of little things like that are the things I remember that I did at the time.
What was it like, if I may ask you, out on the street when the plane hit the towers?
It was panic. It was absolute chaos. People were running. No one knew what had happened because there were a lot of people who wanted to get close to see it. Really, the panic happened when the first tower came down. When the second plane hit and the first tower came down, it was utter panic. I was located south of the towers, and there's no egress there because there are only the bridges, the Brooklyn Bridge, Manhattan Bridge, so you're basically trapped. Most people south of the towers felt trapped. Most people tried to run towards the water and then north, which was the only way you could get out. But it was absolute panic. I was advising people that I saw what to do, mostly my neighbors and friends. And I remember that after the first tower collapsed, I was telling them to dress for winter. And I don't know why words nuclear winter kept going through my head, because you couldn't see anything because you're so close to the ground. People are small, and the dust cloud was so dense you couldn't see in front of you. In fact, I remember calling someone in California because most of my friends on the East Coast, the lines were down or busy. So I kept calling further and further west until I got someone awake in California, which is 6 o'clock, And I asked them to turn on the TV and see what was going on because we couldn't see anything. It was just so black.
That was actually the very next thing I was going to ask you was about the dust clouds, because I've seen pictures of the streets of New York City. Actually, I have met a woman who's an artist who was there at the time. Her apartment windows were blown out, and she took pictures on the street of the devastation after the plane hit, but then more pictures after the towers came down, and you could tell the difference in the time frames because after the towers came down, there was this incredible dust over everything.
That's right. You could get lost. You couldn't see in front of you. In fact, I got lost just going around the corners. The dust clung to all the buildings and wiped out any writing, the shapes became very surreal. You didn't know where you were, and that was also part of the shock, that everything that was recognizable became this gray, dark blob. And I got lost many times just going a couple hundred yards.
Was there also debris in this dust cloud? It wasn't just fine powder, was it?
No, there was everything in it. In fact, we asked the EPA later what was in it, and they said there was everything in it, including human remains. There was, I remember, suitcases, glass. There was a lot of glass, so much glass. You remember, the towers are extremely high, and with the fires and the winds up there, anything that was blown out was caught in an updraft and carried. There were whole windows that were carried all the way down Broadway and made it into the East River, if you can imagine. That's thousands of yards away. People were just staring up, looking, wondering when and where it would come down. It was being carried like a piece of paper. And there were suitcases from people we don't know. We're just assuming that they were in the planes, but it was so random what got thrown out and kicked out, as well as, right around the buildings themselves, there were clearly evidence of the usual debris, human and other remains of an airplane crash, a very serious airplane crash. So that's not in question. I know a lot of people think that. I've heard everything, including that holograms flew into the World Trade Center. Well, I wonder who's paying them to put that out. But one of the things that I couldn't do, even though I'm an avid amateur photographer, is I couldn't take a single photograph, because what kept going through my mind is that this was a crime scene, and here were the remains of people's loved ones on the street. Even if it was just a body part, it was somebody's loved one. And I know it was a crime scene, but I know it was also a world event, but it just seemed horrific to me to even just photograph it. It was, in my opinion, the way I reacted to it, I couldn't take any photographs. But I understand that how necessary it was to have documented every shred of it, given what's happening now.
How long, then, did you work as an emergency medical technician, and exactly what is it that you were doing?
Well, there was so much chaos, Bonnie. There was, when I got there, we were setting up triage sites very close to the area. The triage site that I was setting up was behind, well, to the east of Building 7, where Building 7 came down. And what we were expecting, as an EMT, you're trained for live survivors, and there were people on the pile digging and looking for survivors, and what would happen is they would bring someone out to the nearest triage center. We would stabilize them, put them in an ambulance, and send them further uptown. So we were setting up triage as close to the pile as possible, as on it in many cases. So what we were doing was setting up different kinds of stations, IV stations, cardiac stations, just wound stations, burn stations, just trying to have an organized space. What happened with that particular triage site is that pretty soon afternoon, and after midday on 9/11, we had to evacuate that because they told us Building 7 was coming down. If you had been there, not being able to see very much, just flames everywhere and dark smoke, it is entirely possible. I do believe that they brought Building 7 down because I heard that they were going to bring it down because it was unstable because of the collateral damage. That I don't know. I can't attest to the validity of that. All I can attest to is that by noon or 1 o'clock, they told us we had to move from that triage site up to Pace University, a little further away, because Building 7 was going to come down or being brought down.
Did they actually use the word brought down, and who was it that was telling you this?
The fire department, and they did use the word we're going to have to bring it down. And for us there, observing the nature of the devastation, it made total sense to us that this was indeed a possibility. Given the subsequent controversy over it, I don't know. I'm not an engineer. I don't know. All I know is, that was my experience. We backed off a little bit to Pace University. There was another panic around 4 o'clock because they were bringing the building down. And people seemed to know this ahead of time, so people were panicking again and running. I went back to 1 Liberty, which was further south of where I was before, and there were triage sites set up in there. We were treating basically people who were on the pile digging for survivors, if there were any, and it was basically chaos. I asked who was in charge, for instance, because I'm supposed to check in with whoever's in charge, and no one seemed to know. It was complete and utter chaos there. If there was someone in charge, the normal response units around for a multi-casualty incident, they didn't know. One of the big problems is that so many people in the fire department and the police department at high level had been already killed that there was complete and utter shock and disbelief, and they were still trying to sort out the details.
I know you certainly weren't concentrating on this, but did you happen to notice any fires in World Trade Center 7?
Yes, I think there was. I couldn't get close enough because of the smoke. I couldn't really tell where the fires were coming from. I didn't have a bird's eye view. I was down on the ground and there was all this rubble and devastation around me. If someone had told me there was a fire in Building 7, I would have likely believed it, simply because there were fires everywhere. There were fires because there was so much paper and litter on the streets for hundreds of yards around. There were fires everywhere. It was confetti, sort of like a ticker tape parade. And if someone set fire on the street to a ticker tape parade, it would all burn in a line. So there were just flames everywhere.
What an experience. Are you still emotionally affected by this? I would imagine so.
Yeah. For those of us who responded, you're never prepared for anything like this. The shock of... In a lot of ways, 9/11 World Trade Center was my backyard. And to those of us who live, we put it in the shadow of the Twins. All I can, basically say, this may sound silly, but I refer to the book Divided We Stand, which was a book about the building of the World Trade Center towers. And the people who lived and worked there experienced these two controversial buildings completely differently than the rest of the world. Most people think that you'd go to the top and get vertigo looking down. For those of us who knew, the best vertigo to be had was to be right at the bottom, hold on to one of the corners, and look all the way up. You pretty much couldn't stand. So there were mysterious international structures that were the center and the heart of our Western civilization, basically. I thought that it was pretty remarkable that they were situated in Lower Manhattan. The south end of Manhattan Island was considered sacred ground by Native Americans. And a lot of people thought that one of the reasons Wall Street was so successful is because it was built on such sacred ground. So because I lived there, it was my choice to live there and work there and build my career there. And it hit me, it was my backyard. And my community, my neighbors, my friends, my colleagues, this was personal to us in a way that it wouldn't have been if you were just, for instance, commuting into work. We were very connected to that very special area of Lower Manhattan.
Now, did you work as an emergency medical technician for more than one day? How long did this go on for you?
Well, I worked pretty much nonstop at the One Liberty Triage Center. It went on until Saturday or Sunday, until basically I was so sick that I was experiencing cardiac symptoms, and a friend came to get me and take me out of there. I was pretty stubborn. I wouldn't go to a hospital, but none of us really wanted to be another victim. So I was there until the Sunday, I believe.
And I just wanted to clarify now, wasn't it a Tuesday that this happened?
Yes. So, and I was there fairly nonstop. I don't think I slept for more than an hour or 2 hours for the first 3 days. And I was at the One Liberty Triage site. I was there all of that night, the night of 9/11, 9/12. That was the most remarkable night because we had nothing. We had no food. We had no coffee. I just didn't understand how no one could know how bad it was there, because we literally squeezed 30 cups of coffee out of one sorry bag of grounds. And if you know anything about One Liberty, that building that Merrill Lynch, I think Merrill Lynch had offices in there, but there was Brooks Brothers, a very famous business clothing store for men and women, and there were coats, cashmere coats, and we had no blankets, so I went upstairs to get the coats so that the firefighters would have something to keep them warm. And I remember the guards thinking they couldn't do it, so I gave them my credit card for hundreds of thousands of dollars of cashmere coats, which were, fairly contaminated anyway. But I remember the shift in reality, breaking all the rules. We had no food. The firefighters broke in for food just to get goat cheese and chicken sandwiches. And, it was simultaneously a morgue, a place for firefighters to rest, triage station, and, place to lay out sandwiches all there in the lobby. It was fairly incomprehensible. Outside, you couldn't see. There was this mountain of burning debris. People with tears and horrified looks on their faces, just basically arguing. There were fierce and very heated arguments about the best way to go about removing the debris to reach the survivors that we knew were still alive underneath. And we knew people were still alive until, at least as far as I know, until Thursday afternoon, if not Friday.
So then you were on the scene working as an EMT until the following Saturday or Sunday.
Right.
So maybe 5-6 days.
Yes.
And then what? Your health was being affected.
I couldn't breathe. I was experiencing cardiac symptoms. I'd already treated some people. There was a 29-year-old firefighter who went into cardiac arrest on Wednesday. So there were people rescue workers really were injuring themselves. There was glass. Eye injuries were the most common because of the smoke and the debris and the flames and the sparks from the metal cutting, the torches. It wasn't uncommon to pull glass out of somebody's eyes and them to go right back, burning right through rubber boots. You knew that you had maybe 3 days to get somebody out of there, if that. So you were willing to go to the edge in terms of your own safety. All the rules were broken at that point. So are you saying that in addition to
the professionals and the EMTs like yourself, were then they're just New York citizens in there digging through this rubble?
Well, in at least one case I know, there was a young man who had broken his knee, which I had splinted, I think it was on Wednesday or Thursday, not sure, but he was looking for his brother. And I remember that because he didn't want to be moved from the site, and I think he knew that if he was moved from the site, he would never come back and he would never see his brother again. So I know they were letting him stay so that he could just stay there for a while until we evacuated him. But if you weren't there the first day, you pretty much weren't getting in by the second or the third day. And because, believe it or not, there were people looting the bodies, we didn't want a lot of chaos. There was enough chaos anyway because most of the fire department, police department, the response units had no idea who their new bosses were because their old bosses had perished. So,
wow.
So in terms of, yes, there's so many levels to, my 9/11 experience just from being there, because after 5 or 6 days, since I'm trained for live survivors, and it was clear that I did not want to become, it doesn't help anybody if I become a victim myself. So, and there were going to be no more live survivors. I basically returned home to see what was left of my community. That's when the reality of how 9/11 was going to be spun to the rest of the nation, we hit that head on, because I don't know who could possibly expect a contaminated, toxic site burning. The fires burned for 3 months. The big fire went out on December 18th, but the fires burned into January, and they were burning. I remember calling it a concentration camp fire because they were still cooking the remains of people. It was literally that. The stench was unbelievable. And that was my backyard. And, the EPA refused to declare the site unsafe, the air quality unsafe, even though they had spent enormous amounts of money protecting their own building in Lower Manhattan. Basically, my neighbors came to me. Actually, I should back up, because one of the first things that we did do is my local firehouse had lost 14 men, engine 4 ladder 15. So one of the things that I did, since I had organized the neighborhood with other people before, is I wanted to do a benefit, because firefighters' wives who were in desperate straits, I know that there was a lot of money that people all over the world sent in. The money was pouring in, but it really, even at that time, wasn't getting to the right people. So I held a benefit for our local ladder company. And more than to raise money, it was just to let them know that we appreciated who they were, what they were, and that our neighborhood was there and behind them, who we were. And in order for us to get through this emotionally and physically, we needed to do it together. It was a way to go around to all the neighbors' houses, knock on doors, find out who was in really serious psychological or physical trouble and who wasn't, because no one else was doing it for us. We basically had to do it. A lot of people did flee with their children, never to come back. So we went around from door to door looking at the elderly, people who didn't have the funds to move on, and encouraged them to come to the benefit and just to get out, to meet your neighbors and see how you're doing. A lot of people could not because they were still burying their dead, and a lot of people did come, and they thought it was a wonderful thing. But immediately after that, the neighborhood, we began to schedule meetings because we liked it and needed it to be with each other. We scheduled meetings, and I set up neighborhood post-traumatic stress counseling with Safe Horizons. These groups were beginning to form and began to hold meetings, group counseling sessions. And at those group counseling sessions, what everyone wanted to talk about was how physically sick we were and how the emergency rooms and doctors did not know what to do for us. They had no idea what to do for us. We were exhibiting physical symptoms that they weren't prepared, didn't know what it was.
I was just going to ask you, what time frame is this now? Where are we since September 11th?
Right. I held the benefit October 29th, 2001. The first neighborhood meeting was early in November. And we had, at that point, connected with a similar thing that was going on the other side of Broadway. in Battery Park City, they were organizing there because they were experiencing exactly the same things we were. So we were beginning to coordinate Lower Manhattan. We were beginning to organize and coordinate. We wanted, for instance, one person per building that would speak on behalf of all the tenants, come to meetings, and try to get the politicians to do something with this EPA that had the nerve to look at a toxic waste dump burning out of control for 3 months and say there was absolutely nothing wrong with the air. And I believe even Christy Todd Whitman, she has reversed her opinion, but there were very bitter, heated meetings at the Senate hearings that our local politicians held during that time. This is November 2001. Basically, everyone had been breathing that smoke for about 6 to 8 weeks, and it was beginning to show up.
I can't believe that the government and the city, New York State, they weren't doing anything for people?
No, they were not. They weren't. I mean, the local politicians were Jerry Nadler and Sheldon Silver, the state and local Democratic leaders who also lived down there were livid. And I gave testimony at those hearings. We were angry because we were still in shock from 9/11 and could not believe that this administrative betrayal would be so obvious. And of course, on the news, the whole focus was the Afghanistan war and where is Osama bin Laden and the anthrax attacks. Most of the news of Lower Manhattan was blacked out. For instance, there were, at least that I know of, 11 anthrax scares, 11 times that buildings were evacuated for anthrax scares that caused huge commotions and panicked runnings in the street that reminded everyone of 9/11. That was never reported.
Are you talking about New York City or Washington, D.C.?
New York City. New York City. Lower Manhattan specifically.
No, I never heard about that.
No, and so much went on that went unreported. See, it was considered unpatriotic to dwell on how bad things were down there. I don't know any other way to put it except there's one morning a father brought his 7-year-old son near the barges where they were taking away all the debris, the smoldering debris. They would truck the smoldering debris through our streets at night and offload them onto barges on the East River or wherever. They were still smoldering. Remember, one father brought his 7-year-old kid there to look at it, to see what the terrorists had done. And we tried to tell him that this is toxic stuff and that his child was too young to be smelling and breathing this. And he seemed to think it was his patriotic duty to bring his child to smell this or inhale this toxic stuff. And we realized that the world had gone crazy. But yeah, they were spraying for cholera all the way down to Water Street in October and November. None of that went reported.
At one point, I noticed that you testified as to your physical symptoms and how this had affected your health. What did happen to you just on a physical level?
It's an interesting question because I was in excellent physical condition for my age and gender, and I was training for an 8,000-meter mountain climb. So aerobically, I knew I could be up at 19,000, 20,000 feet with no oxygen, pretty much doing a fair amount of aerobic activity. What happened to me is that what happened to all of us, basically, and it doesn't sound very nice, but this is what happened. We had sores. Some firefighters I know still have these horrific sores all over their body. Our hair fell out, eye infections, shortness of breath, adult onset asthma, chronic coughs, tiredness, extreme fatigue, cardiac symptoms, heart palpitations where you never had any before, irritability, a lot of symptoms that were consistent with neurotoxic poisoning. Those were just the physical symptoms, and in some cases, people reported that their hair fell out and even their dental work fell out. And to me, they were consistent with signs of radiation poisoning. But however, the toxic cocktail that had been burning there, I think a California group went in and analyzed and pretty much came out with the determination that there were about 900 contaminants, 200 different kinds of dioxins. We have the particulate matter, the asbestos, the concrete. They had said that particles were ground so fine that they were the smallest particles ever produced in history, and they blew past all our barriers and lodged right in our lungs. And most of us who were exposed to that are suffering from something called reactive airway disease syndrome, which is something that the coal miners get. But what it means is that from that point on, you cannot be around anything. It pretty much triggers an asthma attack. Stomach problems. What is interesting is that anytime we were ill or not feeling right, the September 11th help services in the Red Cross would try to get us into counseling. And to me, at the end of all of this, it seemed that we experienced the same thing that the Gulf War or other civilians who were exposed to local Superfund site disasters were all told it was in our head. That's exactly what went on down at 9/11. The World Trade Center is just another massive Superfund site. And we were told it was in our head. So if you weren't feeling well, if you were feeling irritable, if you had the feeling that it was just you. It wasn't until I went to a detox program and we got together with everyone else and compared symptoms that we realized that this was an epidemic.
So traditional medicine, and I guess you mentioned before the doctors didn't know how to treat this.
No, they didn't. And even the firefighters told us to go for, they said the Chinese medicine worked, alternative. Never so fast in the history, I think, of the world had so many people who swore that all this alternative stuff was junk. Never so fast did they just turn around to acupuncture and this therapy and that therapy because we were all in trouble. So some people took a mixture of the traditional medicine and alternative medicine. And one of the things that I had insisted on in November was that the hospitals start recognizing and opening programs for the residents. And I found out that Mount Sinai had just got funding for a World Trade Center program, but it was only for rescue workers. And Dr. Levin, who headed that program, because I was at one of the meetings advocating for the neighborhood, said, "You're sick, you can come down here. We only have room for 200 people, but I'll make sure you get in." The earliest appointment was December 7th, 2001. And I said, "Well, that's fine. What do I go back and tell my neighbors that because I was a rescue worker, I'm eligible for your stuff and for your program, and they're not?" So when the first programs began to be configured, it was only to monitor what our symptoms were and to track us over time. There were very little intervention programs available to us at the beginning. And in many cases, the baseline tests were all lost.
The baseline test, what do you mean by that?
Well, what happens is when you go to the World Trade Center program, you are evaluated, your pulmonary capacity, your cardiac, your blood. They tested for mercury and heavy metals, a lot of heavy metal poisoning, lead, and you know what's in computers and in modern buildings, pretty much everything. And so a lot of those tests that I heard from other people sitting in the waiting room that I followed up with later, they couldn't find them. They were lost. They were trucked somewhere. What happened is the programs were funded for maybe 6 months, and then some other group would come in and fund it, so they would start over again. So we were very jaded, wondered whether that was deliberate or just normal administrative incompetence.
And what about your apartment? I assume you were living in an apartment in Manhattan.
Yeah, my apartment was basically when I came back. Remember, I'm walking on the streets and it's completely contaminated. I walked into my apartment, dust was everywhere, on everything. The dust fell for years. The particles were so small, they just kept falling for years. Our dust patterns were such that if you dusted in the morning, 2 hours later, you had to dust again. And every time we cleaned, we would get sick. And that's why we called the EPA to find out what was in it. And we would get really sick to the point where we couldn't move. We felt paralyzed almost. Because the EPA decided that nothing was wrong with the air, they wouldn't provide cleaning, so we had to either do it ourselves. I know a lot of the corporations hired cleaners, undocumented workers, many of whom got horrifically sick and died. I actually went to the CDC and asked them, insisted in December, and I was pretty out of control at that time. I insisted they start a secondary body count because my neighbors had already started dying. And basically, if you were elderly or had some kind of illness and 9/11 hit and you were living there, you probably didn't make it.
Wow. Did they ever come up with the causes of the deaths?
No. They wouldn't. A lot of people left, knew that the area was making them sick, so they scattered. And as a result, we have lost the ability to track people. A lot of people who came to help us, I am sure, came back home. Firefighters from even California went back home with symptoms. And the reason I know this is I talked to rescue workers who came from New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and I spoke to them as recently as 6 months ago. These are real macho types, and they don't want to admit to things. And they would say, well, does this happen to you too? And I go, yes, it does. It's happened to all of us. And if you know other people who are down there, please, there is a way to fix it. But full-body steroids is not the way.
Indira, you mentioned a little bit earlier these very, very fine particulate dust. And you mentioned a report that talked about this particulate matter. What is that report? Does it have a name?
There were several reports. Because of the investigations that I ended up doing later, I put a lot of the environmental stuff away. I'm sure that if somebody Googled it, they could probably come up with it. It's something that I'd have to go through my files and look for. A UPI reporter by the name of Alex Kukan, who actually covered Love Canal, she was amazing. She was amazing. She helped us through it, and she got the key stories out in December, in April, and in May when the EPA suddenly agreed to clean based on political and community pressure. But that was 9 months later. Alex Kukan, she talked to us and told us what to expect and set our expectations about what the government and the administration would and would not do for us. And boy, was she ever right. We owe her a huge debt for just helping us get through that time. Some of the things that she told us, she said after an incident like this, the 1 month anniversary, the 3 month and the 6 month anniversary are going to be really hard. The 9 not so hard. The 1 year is going to be horrific. So I can't thank her enough.
Now, your health has improved greatly since you went through detox, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. It has, because what happened is when the towers fell, I know it registered on the Richter scale. And, for instance, the Federal Reserve Building, their walls cracked. And there are actually signs, if you go on a tour through there where you can see evidence of it. Well, the building I lived in was a landmark building, very old, Revolutionary War era. And it cracked as well. So we had what the maintenance people called the 9/11 blob moving through the walls and recontaminating us. But something very odd happened. We ended up getting the same kind of mold and fungus that was in the Deutsche Bank building, which was right opposite the World Trade Center. And we don't know why, but it was also in my building, in my apartment. So in addition to all the dust, we were exposed to this 9/11 fungus or mold or whatever that came through. So after I went through a detoxification program, I was still living in the apartment and I was coming back down with symptoms, and that's when they advised me to leave and go to California. The doctors there did, and said I needed to get out of the apartment as it was recontaminating me.
Did I hear you correctly when you said that your apartment went back to the Revolutionary era?
Yes, it's basically a George Washington slept here block. But the building had been built and rebuilt several times. So when I left in 2004, last year, and I came out to California and began to pay attention to the other injuries I had sustained down there. For the longest time, it was all about my lungs and the organs that were being affected. I didn't get around to the orthopedic injuries until, last year.
Orthopedic injuries with regard to what? Stumbling around? That kind of thing?
Yeah, I was, there was a rescue worker stampede off the pile because collateral buildings were so unstable that it was hard to see if something would fall and collapse. And so, there would be a signal, 3 bells and a whistle, and people would rush off the pile. They were working in teams, 19 teams, 20 exits, and I just got caught up in one of those, and I got basically trampled. But you're in another world when you were down there. You weren't feeling pain at all. People could work with broken fingers, and just the adrenaline levels were just so high you didn't even notice anything. And it's kind of interesting because for those of us who sought compensation for some of our injuries, especially if we didn't have health insurance because everyone lost their jobs because of what happened there, it's something that is recognized that rescue workers will not even notice they're injured for at least 2 or 3 months before they calm down and start paying attention to themselves.
So you worked as an EMT then for 5 or 6 days.
Right.
You continued to live in Manhattan, in that apartment for what, an additional 3.5 years?
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
Wow.
I have been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress, but I try not to. What happened is that in order for me to be taken seriously by CBS, by any investigator, I had to put all of that away because they said, she's just some stressed out. Yeah, I had to bury it. And it was very hard for me, having gone through the administrative betrayal of the EPA and the government denying us that, to realize that they had deliberately allowed this to happen. See, that's as far as I knew, that they deliberately let this happen. It wasn't until much later I knew so much more about not only did they actually were involved with it. What I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt by the ending of May 2002 was that they had deliberately looked the other way. And that, for me, before Ground Zero had closed, was like going to the bottom of the pit again. It was like a 9/11 all over again.
Indira, now, all of this time before September 11, 2001, and subsequently, you were working. Where were you working?
September 11th, I was consulting. I was a senior consultant for J.P. Morgan Chase in risk. I had cycled through several of their risk areas as an enterprise architect, or information architect, a technology architect, and an enterprise architect, which basically means that you take a look at the entire enterprise and come up with a blueprint to make sure that all the systems, not just one system, but all the systems, the blueprints for all the systems that are developed to support the business are in line, in tune with the business goals and the business architecture and the business processes and where the business is going. So it's pretty high level, and work at we call the CXO levels, the Chief Information Officer, Chief Technology Officer levels, and there are disciplines and methodologies and very esoteric software that's used to manage this. And I did that at J.P. Morgan Chase, and I also worked for a small company in Washington, D.C. that was doing some very innovative work regarding technology interoperability. They were developing some inference engines to think about how to put architectures together, technology architectures together, and I wanted to use that for my risk work, basically. It was interesting that we were seeking funding from In-Q-Tel, which was the CIA's IT-seeking, information technology-seeking arm. I had been spending pretty much every Thursday, Friday, down in D.C. trying to get that project off the ground and trying to get it funded.
So at this time you were working for 2 different companies?
That's correct, yeah. Right.
Could you explain a little bit about what enterprise architecture is and some of the other terms you've used? You're talking about information technology and data, right?
That's correct.
Computer type work.
Right. It is, but at some point the systems and the computers that are used in a business are used to support the functions and processes of that business. And at the highest level, for instance, in a bank, they have trading floors, they have retail operations, and they need systems that will help execute the business, help conduct the business, and do all the front office, middle office, back office kind of functions. Make sure that all the business efforts are consolidated and reported on and comply with the rules, internal and external, that govern the industry. So it's a fairly tall order. And at the end of the day, you want your systems that are, for instance, doing trading swaps in Tokyo to be consistent with those systems that are trading something else in New York. And at the end of the day, you want to know what your total business was. And if you want to change your product service offering, that means that your systems have to change in sync with it. And So the best way to make this happen is to work off blueprints rather than have one-off systems. So pretty much everyone has a business blueprint, a technology blueprint, and various other aspects of everything that work together. It's pretty much like what you would expect if you were building a building. You couldn't just go in with a load of bricks and put them down. Similarly, you couldn't just go in with a bunch of computers and expect to help run the business. You need some form of blueprint. So enterprise architecture is the discipline, and we use the word architecture, is the blueprinting of the business and the resources and systems that help implement and support it.
This sounds like it's highly technical.
Yes, it is. It's highly technical, but what's interesting about this is it requires you to understand the business inside out. So it's not only the technology that you need to know about, but you also need to know the intricacies of banking. And in banking, it's all about risk. So it's about credit risk, it's about operational risk, it's about market risk, and so on. And so, which is why I was pioneering the field of risk enterprise architecture or risk architecture, and why I called myself a risk architect, because my point was that unless you really understood risk management and enterprise architecture and merged the field, you really weren't going to get that synergy between where the business was headed and what you needed to make sure nothing went wrong in the business, which is risk management. You can keep that and all those rules and goals and ideas in sync with the systems that are implemented to conduct the business. So you needed a pretty smart piece of software to think about this, to even blueprint all of this, and once you've blueprinted it, to sort of keep track of what was going on in the organization to make sure that every system was in sync, or the results of the business transactions and positions and whatever in the bank were in sync with what should be.
So in your position in risk management with J.P. Morgan Chase, were you developing software to do this?
Yes, I was developing the methodology, how to think about it. That was part one. Part two was gaining consensus firm-wide that this is the way that we were going to look at, for instance, operational risk management. This is how we were going to do operational risk management at J.P. Morgan Chase. And once everyone had agreed to that, we were going to phase in by developing software that would help implement it. So it was a multi-phased project. Of course, the agreement was done at a very high level. Then once we had gotten the agreement, we would go out and look at vendors that would help us implement our ideas.
And so you were developing an architecture then that would take a look at all aspects of the business at J.P. Morgan Chase.
Right, in near real time. Because the thing about risk management, the thing about risk in the financial industry, over the past 10 years, you have these huge horror stories, for example, Barings, where you had a rogue trader that basically exploited holes in the system, and by the time he was caught, it was too late. The bank went down and brought a lot of other businesses and enterprises down. So we wanted to move from a reactive to a proactive way of looking at what was going on. You can't wait till the horse is too far bolted out of the barn. You have to really take a look at what's going on. And because financial crimes can be so complex, money laundering, it's not just looking at one transaction. It's looking at a whole pattern or system over time of transactions to see what someone might or might not be up to. And then, of course, there are the usual normal errors that occur. Innocent errors, careless errors, that sort of thing.
I remember that case that you mentioned with Barings. Wasn't that trader in Singapore?
Yes, he was. Yes.
I remember that. He brought the whole operation down, didn't he?
Nicholson, yes, he did. He did. And really, it was because he was allowed to take positions that actually, if someone was paying attention, they would have stopped him before he went too far. And this is the interesting thing, because there is, in banking and financial institutes, a number of, how shall I put it, a number of transactions wherein we are basically forced to look the other way. So it becomes a matter of not knowing what's what. For instance, in my work in credit risk, I could not get compliance in certain offices to comply with the blueprint, the informational blueprint. No matter who I went to, there was just never going to be compliance. So I just wrote up what I saw And I figured as long as I could write and the regulators could read, that was it. I wasn't going to go any further than that. As a senior consultant, I had done my job. And I could bang my head against the wall, maybe a little bit more than others. But, I know that there were other analysts, other risk managers who, for instance, with some of the vehicles that were created to support the activities of Enron, and they were highly incensed and they left the firm. That's a whole other show.
Now, Indira, while you were developing the software, you had to go to an outside vendor, right?
That's correct.
To either develop additional software or help you with what you were doing. And I noticed in some of the things you've written, you considered going to Microsoft or IBM or some other tech-type company.
Right. So basically, imagine you have a huge blueprint and you decide that for this piece of it, you're going to develop it in-house, or for this piece of it, you can get some off-the-shelf software, but for the most important pieces of it, you might have to go to a specialty house. And at the end of the day, you'd have basically your own operational risk management system. Yes, the most important piece that we wanted to have developed was not found in Microsoft or IBM. However, it was found with a small company, and when small companies have boutique software, they usually align themselves with a larger company. And why? Because software is generally if it provides some very high-level functionality, chances are a major corporation will want to use it. And major corporations tend to not want to deal with very small companies for very good reasons. What happens if they're poorly managed and go out of business? Then a very critical piece of their software is all of a sudden, no longer available for the business. So most of these small companies do align themselves with the larger companies. So we would go to an IBM and say, do you have any alliance with a smaller vendor that you think is pretty good in this field or the other field? And of course we utilize that tactic in fulfilling our software requirements.
So who did you end up consulting with or choosing to work on this software with you?
I went to the gurus in the industry, including those in D.C. who are in enterprise architecture, which is a pretty select field, a pretty small niche, fairly high-level people. I showed them pretty much my ideas, what I wanted to do, and I asked them recommendations. I had come up with a list of 2 or 3, and I'm a very consensus-oriented person, and they actually said Ptech, and I said I have concerns that it's a small vendor, and they asked me, well, why not Ptech? They didn't like recommending a vendor because in case something went wrong down the line, but they recommended to this company that was based in Boston, actually a suburb of Boston, Quincy, by the name of Ptech, which stands for Process Technology. I didn't know very much about it. I had utilized consultants prior who had used Ptech and were very familiar with it and spoke highly of the capabilities of the software. And so I moved ahead with it, especially when I found out that they had forged an alliance with IBM, and IBM was basically their quote-unquote big brother that would fund them and shepherd them through, give them marketing opportunities. So because they had signed an agreement with IBM, we were able to bring in the company under IBM security clearances and agreements with non-disclosure agreements that IBM had with JP Morgan, because we're a very large company. Most large banks have agreements with the major software vendors like IBM and Microsoft. So that's how we were evaluating many software packages, software houses, risk houses, and Ptech was one of several that came on board.
So now you invited them over for a business meeting to see whether or not you wanted to hire them.
Right. I had basically been told, why not Ptech, April 28th, 2002. So in the following weeks, I had worked out the details with IBM, with our security, with my supervisors, with my boss, with the various other groups that would be interested. For instance, in any large company, you can't make unilateral decisions, especially if you're dealing on an enterprise level. You have to get buy-in with the various boards, technology advisory boards that are internal, and a lot of people were interested in evaluating Ptech. My project was one of the first out of the door. So we had pretty much a lot of consensus that this was a thing to do, to bring them in. And that took a couple of weeks. So it wasn't until the third week of May 2002 that everything was cleared for them to come up. We had prearranged that they would have a one-day session with us and would provide a presentation to a group of high-level people in risk and in other corporate departments that I was responsible for assembling. And one of the important characteristics that we wanted to have it tested was the ability to change things on the fly, the adaptability and agility of the software. And in order for us to test that out, we set them a test, basically, that they would arrive at the premises at a particular time, and they would modify their software to address some of our requirements. And we would then demo this at about 1 or 2 in the afternoon, and then make a decision whether we would go to the next step and bring them on board for the next level of software development. So we had a number of conversations and how we would set up the presentation prior to this. A lot of emails confirming who would be there, security clearances, their backgrounds, what would happen, pretty much on an hour-to-hour basis.
How did that go?
Well, they came a little late. Immediately there were some issues with how the day would proceed. For instance, they showed up without the agreed-on software in hand. The most important thing about it is that their chief scientist, Dr. Hussein Ibrahim, came. He's an Egyptian American, and he had a very good reputation in the field, very bright, someone you would like working with, very knowledgeable. But they had showed up without the software, and what I had done was isolated a workstation, took it off the net. After all, we were testing whether the software would meet our criteria, and if I had said it did, then that would be a big deal if it subsequently couldn't. So I needed to start with an out-the-box version of Ptech. They didn't bring that, and Dr. Ibrahim said, that's not a problem. We can develop the demo on his laptop. And if you know anything about these things, that's like a no-no, because at the end of the day, he's walking out the door, and I don't have anything. And he's walking away with pretty much enough of how we're thinking about doing operational risk. Now, operational risk is about how to spot bad things that are going on in a financial institution, things like rogue trading, money laundering, and so on and so forth. And it's very subtle. Our intellectual property, at least what JP Morgan was hiring me for, was to think innovatively out of the box for the next generation. How do you proactively design a blueprint to spot these things? And that's pretty big. People are smart enough to get an idea, oh, they're thinking of going down this road. That's a big deal. So I was a risk person, so I'm very aware of not to expose our intellectual property or that of the company I am consulting for. I'm very protective of that. So they showed up without the software, and that was a huge enough red flag that I began paying attention to them. A couple other things went on, and within half an hour I just walked over to the same people who had recommended them and began calling, and I said to one of them, I have the Ptech people here. And the reaction was not the reaction I would have ever expected. It was, what are they doing on site? And I said, well, you recommended them. And they said, no, you should have come through a distributor, an American distributor. And I said, JP Morgan reserves a right to work directly with the company, and besides which they are a preferred vendor of IBM. They're a preferred vendor program, and that's the way we work. We don't work through small distributors. If we're going to go with this software as a standard, we're going to go right to the source and make the agreements there. So I said, what is the problem? And basically this person said, don't let them out of your sight. And that's when my stomach sank. So you have to understand how all of a sudden I'm beginning to see these people in a different way, because when they said, don't let them out of your sight, I have a Middle Eastern company there, and we're taught not to discriminate, and that was not something that I was about to do. And to prove that they were there being evaluated, so that is never, going to be a bone of contention, although later people made that an issue. But if I had a problem working with a Middle Eastern company, they would have never been there in the first place, much less before Ground Zero closed. And no problem whatsoever having them up there. I like the idea.
What do you mean Ptech was a Middle Eastern company?
Well, that's what subsequently was revealed in the phone call, that their financier, their funders, their investors were all Saudis. And I said, so what? And they said, one Saudi has been placed on the U.S. terror list, October 12th, 2001. And I said, it got very quiet. I said, you better have proof of that, because having thrown that into my lap now, this is not something that I can ignore. I have to follow up on it. This is not something I can ignore or pretend would go away or have someone else handle. This is risk management at the highest levels of one of the largest banks in the world. It is my responsibility to deal with this. And I said, how can I get proof of this? And that's when they started saying, you need to talk to Jeff Goins, who was one of the only 3 people in Ptech who knew of this relationship. You see, it was that well hidden within Ptech. And so I subsequently called Jeff Goins and I said, well, if this is true, did you not report this? Ptech is a private company, so this relationship would have been privy only to those on the inside. I said, did you report it anywhere that someone who has been placed on the U.S. terror list is key funder, angel investor to a company whose software is utilized at the highest levels of almost every government and military and defense organization in this country, including the Secret Service, the FBI, the Department of Defense, the House of Representatives, the Treasury Department, the IRS, the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Air Force, and last but not least, the Federal Aviation Administration.
Are you saying these were all Ptech clients?
These were all Ptech clients, and when I was evaluating them, I was pretty impressed. Why not Ptech? Exactly. They're being used at the highest levels of all of these organizations. So I was very excited about using them and having their software be able to be at the heart of what I wanted to develop. And I had no reason to believe that if they were in use everywhere at that caliber, that I would have a problem. And they're also used in Enron. Perhaps I should have thought twice about that, but they're at use in IBM, of course, and the top accounting firms, and even in the FBI. In MITRE.
What is MITRE?
MITRE is a large company that does specialized technology for defense and intelligence. You would not expect to have an exposure with a company that was so well entrenched and embedded in these kinds of organizations.
So what about the meeting? Then did they leave? Is what happened?
Because basically my position was until I had proof, I could not react. That would have been very unprofessional of me. And so I thought of a number of scenarios that could be going on at that point. I thought it might have been, competitiveness, out of control, distributors wanting the JP Morgan account. It could have been anything. However, the one thing that was true is that the chief investor, Sheikh Yassin Qadi, was indeed placed on the U.S. terror list, because while I was talking to them, while they were still there, I checked out a website that had a list of everyone who had been placed on the terror list. The missing piece was, of course, proving that Sheikh Yassin Qadi was indeed affiliated with Ptech, was an owner of Ptech, because it was a private company. I mean, you could say that anybody was an investor, any bad guy or good guy was an investor. Proving it was another thing. So I let everything ride, but I kept an eye on things. And in fact, we did have a presentation that went very, very well, because in no way, shape, or form was I going to jeopardize that.
So what happened next? Did you go on working with them, or did you start to investigate Ptech?
Well, I continued multitasking. I was working with them. I placed a few phone calls, and people got back to me later that day while they were still on premises. So I was able to separate the concerns, accomplish the task, evaluate the software anyway, start the phone calls to start getting more information. Then my report would have been, this is the software, it's used everywhere, it can do what we want it to do. However, we have this issue with the company, and present that to my superiors and let them decide.
Then did you start investigating the company?
Yes. What happened next was I spoke with Jeff Goins, and he told me that basically not only was Yassin Qadi was an investor, but that a Yaqub Mirza was on the board of directors, and he had been the subject of Operation Green Quest. Many of his Herndon, Virginia vehicles and companies and financing companies had been raided in March 2002. And again, that Mirza was on the board of directors. As we spoke, other names started to come out. my head was pretty much spinning at this point, and I said, have you reported any of this to the FBI? And the answer came back, yes. So I wrote a report to the FBI, and I said, okay, if the Boston FBI has been told, I need to speak with people there, because it's not just my group that's evaluating them, it's so many other groups, but I couldn't believe that if this was all true, that Ptech was still being used by the Department of Defense. There's something a little bizarre about all of this, and really I was beginning to understand unwillingly that the world was not the way we thought of it.
Now, this person that you were discussing this with, Jeff Goins,
yeah.
Was he an employee of Ptech?
Yes, he was. He's one of the key people at Ptech. He held several important positions. He had traveled to Saudi Arabia, and he had met with Yassin Qadi, and he had met with most of the investors. His last position was vice president of sales, which for a small company is pretty significant. He worked with Ptech, helping build the company for 5 years, and he was the one that was based in Virginia, who was responsible for getting a lot of the government accounts with, of course, Osama Ziadi, who was the president. Osama Ziadi is a Lebanese-American who, according to Jeff, got a citizenship under very questionable circumstances, which involves the INS. Now, this is all according to Jeff, so at some point later in the week, I had decided to go down to Virginia and meet with not only Jeff, but a number of other Ptech and ex-Ptech employees, because this was beginning to sound like a Tom Clancy novel, and I needed proof. I told them I needed emails, I needed documents, I needed hard evidence. But in the meantime, within a day or two, I had contacted my rep at IBM, and I said, I need to walk outside with you and talk to you about something. If you guys are thinking of getting seriously in bed with this company, I would suggest that you do some background investigation so that your clients, like JP Morgan and myself, don't end up in the situation. His name was Kyle Hilligos. Kyle told me that he, quote-unquote, wrote a book report and sent it to his legal department, and he was told to just back off the whole thing. In fact, he didn't want to have anything to do with me as I continued investigating. Jeff did get the agents at the FBI, the Boston FBI office, to call me back. And with Kyle listening in, so it wasn't just me reporting on what Jeff had said, we spoke to the FBI agent who had picked up the information that Jeff had reported on Ptech when Yassin Qadi was placed on the terror list in October 2001. Remember, this is 8 or 9 months later. So my question to him is, if you have an investigation that's ongoing, that's fine, and we don't want to get involved with it or impede it in any way. But in the meantime, this country's infrastructure is seriously exposed, and I cannot, if any of this is true, cannot, and I need some evidence, something that you can give me to hang my hat on it when I report this, that this is true, that this isn't just someone making a terrorism report, that you know that this is true. And basically what he said is, Indira, you're in a better position on the outside to get the proof that's needed than I am. And I asked him to check with his supervisor. I said, do you understand how serious this is to have a company with this alleged terrorism connection at the highest levels of corporate America and the U.S. infrastructure? And I said, if you don't know, we need to make you aware of this. He apparently went to a supervisor, and the supervisor had said that the position wouldn't change. Now, the Boston FBI office, you can check this out, it was rated as one of the worst in terms of corruption, and I believe the Whitey Bulger incident, the connections between the FBI and the mafia have been, how should I put it, extremely well explored in the Boston FBI office, the ex-governor of Massachusetts, I believe. Anyway, this mob character, Whitey Bulger's brother, was in a very high-level political position in Massachusetts and Boston. And in fact, if people were to read Peter Lance's book, Cover Up, he explores it very well and backs up a lot of what I had found here, the interaction between organized crime and the FBI. So when they said they weren't going to proceed,
And by they, you're talking about the FBI?
The FBI. I said I need something to hang my hat on. And so he sent me a videotape. And the videotape, which I have here, the substance of the videotape was a news clip. It was a news clip of a CBS affiliate based in Boston called WBZ-TV. And their investigative reporting team, the I-Team, which was led by investigative reporter Joe Bergantino, had investigated a number of Middle Eastern men who were sought after 9/11. They were affiliated with Muslim Islamic terrorism financing charities. He had created this clip to show the connection between the 9/11 terror attack and the financial vehicles that were supposedly used to fund it. And what he did was very interesting. The I-Team connected CARE International, not the big CARE International, but something called CARE International that was based in Boston, all the way back to Al-Qifa, which was the financing vehicle at the center of the World Trade Center bombing in 1993, all the way back to something called Maktab al-Khidmat, which means the office, which was a financing vehicle that was set up by the CIA for the Pakistani ISI back in the days when Osama bin Laden was America's fair-haired boy and was on our side fighting with the Mujahideen, fighting the Soviet Union. So the question to me was, my goodness, when I saw the videotape, what is Maktab al-Khidmat doing being run out of Ptech on 9/11? And the reason I say being run out of Ptech is that the faces in the videotape were the faces of core employees at Ptech. Now remember, this is a small company. There were only one or two people who had access to the source code in Ptech, and that is a very trusted position, and he was one of them. His name is Suhail Laher. The people who started CARE International, some of them were actually on an FBI terror watch list prior to 9/11 in Boston.
What do you mean by the source code?
Well, all software products has some group or organization or person writes code that is then packaged up, and for instance, the word processor in your desk, the spreadsheet, and so on and so forth, the browser is all written in some sort of code. Those are the keys to it, and if you wanted to improve it, add new functionality, you would change the original code and add new functionality and then repackage it and send it out there. So whoever had access to the source code of Ptech, that was where the value was. If you lost the source code, you essentially lost the product for all intents and purposes, marketing point of view. So only one or two people would have access to the source code. It would be like having the formula for Coca-Cola, basically.
Now, let's go over that a little bit again. Now, you were talking about the CARE International and some other funding groups that have been, funding international terrorism.
That's correct.
And also have been funded by the CIA?
Well, the roots of Al-Qifa and CARE International, if you look at it, were way back in the late 80s, around the time of Iran-Contra, for instance. Maktab al-Khidmat was set up so that monies could be passed to Osama bin Laden and the Mujahideen when they were fighting the Soviet. Now, I won't go into a lot of detail, but it ended up that Osama bin Laden took that over and was running Al-Qaeda through that. The connections to the Pakistani ISI still stood. The connections to the CIA still stood, not in the way that was originally set up, but through a black or a gray operation that had been later confirmed to me. At the end of the day, when I was finished with certain parts of the investigation, it was clear to me that there's no way Ptech could have done all of this without a lot of inside help. And that's what I began focusing on, that it was a cutout, that it was a front. Was it a regular CIA front? Was it a clandestine front? What was it? You know, there are walls within the FBI, walls within the CIA, behind which these operations take place. And who is behind those operations, is a key question. Now, people might say, oh, this is all conspiracy theory, but I would like to remind people that conspiracy is very much recognized by the United States Federal Code, and it's called RICO, racketeering and influence, and it is very much recognized because there's so much power in these organizations that they have rules in place. For instance, the DCIA, the director of CIA, cannot, after his term of DCIA, subsequently run for vice president or president, which is what happened with George Herbert Walker Bush. That rule was bent for him. He went on from being the DCIA, to running for vice president. That's a no-no.
Well, it sounds like you're describing an interlocking relationship then between this software company funded by Saudis and funded by whomever, the United States government, U.S. corporations, and then known groups globally that are accused of staging terrorist attacks. It's all of a piece.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things I want to say is maybe those organizations don't fully know who their masters are. And Ptech is the one thread, the one golden thread you pull on. All of this is unraveled because it goes into the corporations, it goes into these government entities, it goes into the terrorism financing entities that none of which have been, oh, by the way, taken to task. And there are just so many questions about what does this all mean. And as I investigated further, we found that the origins of Ptech were very interesting. Where did this company come from, obviously, is the first question. And how did they get to be so powerful? Who were the people? Who were the organizations that brought them in? Who knew? Who gave them the power? Who, for instance, signed off Ziadi's U.S. citizenship without doing background checks? Who said that they had a bad feeling doing that? Who gave them influential... I remember that Ptech's competitors, U.S. companies, were extremely annoyed at the fact that they could not get equal time, that all the plum contracts were going to a foreign-owned company. And I said, well, did you know they were foreign-owned? And if they're foreign-owned, they couldn't get certain classified projects. And he said, Indira, everyone knew. Some of the competitors said everyone knew that they were Saudi-owned, and that meant that they got favorable treatment on Capitol Hill. And I said, well, are you saying that they just got favored treatment, or if there was something more going on, they wouldn't answer? Their lawyers instructed them not to answer, so they knew a lot of what was going on.
Who were you talking to about this?
Well, in one particular case, I was talking to one of their competitors, Popkin Software. And, I have no problem naming names because I think that in the memory of 3,000 U.S. civilians and worldwide civilians who were murdered, if we are going to wage wars and spill blood around the world, we ought to take a look at this and just have the truth come out. Because the truth has not come out. There's been a lot of speculation, there's been a lot of innuendo, but there hasn't been hard proof. And Ptech is the one situation where you can get hard proof. When we investigated Ptech and the people behind it, where they came from, we found out that one of the founding members was a man by the name of Solomon Bahari. He was one of the founding directors, and he had put together a vehicle called BMI, which stands for Baitul Mal. Now, BMI was, identified as being involved with terror financing, but this is just not going to be the Muslims hate America. That's not what it is. There is something else going on here. And they're being used as a tool, just as the good people of the United States are being misled into and frightened and terrorized into, if we don't wage these horrific wars, our way of life will be over. Who benefits from that?
What else did your investigation of Ptech turn up? Didn't you meet with several employees or former employees of Ptech?
Yes. It goes back to when all of this was being revealed to me. Now, this is the last week of May 2002. The last day, or June 1 or so of 2002, lo and behold, out of nowhere, the Chicago FBI enters the picture. We have Agent Robert Wright, the Chicago FBI, who's giving congressional testimony, and he stands on the steps of the Capitol, bursts into tears, apologizes to the 9/11 families, victims, that he didn't do everything he could to prevent 9/11 from happening, that his investigations were repeatedly shut down. And I almost fell over because he announced that his investigation was the investigation into Yasin Qadi, the same Sheikh Yasin Qadi who was the money man behind Ptech. And you could not ask for a more direct connection to 9/11 than that. I will even discount the fact that some ex-Ptech employees told me that when I went to see them, I presented all the terror list faces and whatever, and they had indicated that they had seen some pass through Ptech. In fact, one or two had mentioned that they thought one of the hijackers had actually passed through Ptech. And I said, did you report this to the FBI? Can you tell me when? Can you get evidence of it? Can you get litigation quality evidence, something that would stand up? Whatever you can get, give it to me. Make copies, give it to the FBI. I still thought they were on our side.
The FBI, you mean?
The FBI, in fact, and this has to be made very clear, there are some extraordinarily real patriotic Americans and good people in the FBI, as has been said by, I believe, Agent Colleen Rowley, one of the FBI whistleblowers, bosses, that there's a wall in the FBI. And this has been validated to me by various attorneys in Houston who are very close to the power bases and are pretty ticked off at what's happening in this country, and they're speaking out, as are many CIA agents who are very concerned that it has gone too far, as are many NSA agents who are concerned that it's gone too far, and FBI agents. So we have a lot of people who are speaking out. They've kept quiet too long. They're afraid. They're afraid of what's happening to this country. And when I say the Third Reich, what is happening to this country, they say, and I will identify they, if pressed, they say will make the Third Reich look like a Tea Party. I guess we have that many more billion people to control on this planet.
And when you say they say, are you referring to people that you've spoken with in the FBI?
Absolutely. Within the FBI, within the CIA. One of the things I didn't want to have happen is that when Ptech was finally raided in December 2002, something that took all of 6 months, a tremendous amount of agony to have happen, the White House, Ari Fleischer, spun it to find sugar that day. He said, oh, there's nothing wrong, nothing here, nothing to see here, everything's fine. So they did a token raid, and that was basically it. But everything that I have done since that time has been for one reason and one reason only, that there may come a time that people will find the trail to Ptech, and it won't be hidden or buried. I've kept it alive. Whether they renamed their company and moved on, I want to keep the names, the details, everything alive, no matter what I have to do, so that should there come a time for justice and accounting for 9/11 and for what's happening in the world today, it makes it easier for other people to unravel the truth. So I have gone to the mainstream press. I've gone to people on the left of left, on the right of right, and I've talked to them face to face and said, this is wrong. Whatever your political inclinations, this is wrong. This is criminal. This is murder. This is worldwide atrocity. And I have reached some very good people on the left and on the right who are willing to speak out about Ptech. I've contacted the alternative press. The alternative press has, very much like the Nine Blind Men and the Elephant, they touch a piece of Ptech, they understand it, and they say, well, this fits my theory of how things went wrong. I have no problem with that, because the facts are the facts. If someone wants to spin it to fit their particular viewpoint, for instance, from the Wilderness, has said that, well, the software that's in Ptech is very much like Promise, the prosecutor's management information system that has a whole cargo cult behind it of these legendary capabilities. Well, maybe back in the 80s and 90s it was legendary, but today you can do pretty amazing things with software. It's not a big deal. But anyway, from the Wilderness and Mike Rupert, for instance, thesis was that Dick Cheney was running an alternate command and control center that day, confusing everyone. And in fact, there were 4 war games that were going on 9/11. And who knows why the fighters weren't scrambled in time. Who knows all of this? In fact, the fighter to Pennsylvania was scrambled in time because we have firsthand proof, whistleblowers within the correct organizations that was shot down. It's just that Let's Roll was a better story, perhaps a story that the American people could handle, but no. I was told at Ground Zero that day, we heard them go over and we knew they were shot down. We were told. It was just later that we were told, well, the passengers brought it down. Well, if you're running a country and you're really under terrorist attack, that might be the way to go. empower people by saying, if this bad thing happens to you, get up and do something and have a story. I really don't have such a big problem with that, but the fact of the matter is it was shut down.
Oh, and that's interesting. And you heard that on the day of September 11th.
Yes, I did. And it was corroborated a couple of weeks ago by people who were in a particular situation room.
Did you want to say anything more about that?
Well, it is possible that there was an alternate command and control system that could you technically use Ptech software to do surveillance and intervention? Well, gosh, yes. That's exactly what I was planning on using it for in one of the largest banks in the world. It's not a problem. So if someone wants to make it their thesis, I have no problem with that. However, I can't say for sure that that was going on because I don't have direct firsthand, knowledge of that. No one has told me and offered me proof of that. But could I state that it could happen? Absolutely, it could have happened. Was it necessary for it to have happened in order for us to have a 9/11? I don't know. I don't think so. Maybe, maybe not. That's not my point. The towers came down, 3,000 people were killed, and what I know is the characters behind the funding of it were totally in bed with characters in the United States, and not only just for 9/11, but going on throughout our nation's history. And the big question is why? What are they up to?
Could you describe the relationship of Ptech with the FAA? Now, Ptech worked with the FAA for several years, didn't they?
They worked the FAA. It was a joint project between Ptech and MITRE, and they were looking at. It's interesting. They were looking at basically holes in the FAA's interoperability with responding with other agencies, law enforcement, in the case of an emergency such as a hijacking. So they were looking for the escalation process, what people would do, how they would respond in case of an emergency, and find the holes and make recommendations to fix it. Now, if anyone was in a position to understand where the holes were, Ptech was, and that's exactly the point. And if anybody was in a position to write software to take advantage of those holes, it would have been Ptech.
Explain what interoperability is.
Most people are familiar with eBay, and you know that it's a collaborative bidding situation. You bid for a particular item, a certain amount of time passes, and the winning bid is selected according to certain rules. And once the winning bid is selected, then something else happens. Then something else happens. The thing is bought, and then it's taken down off eBay. Well, these are a sequence of steps that occur. It's a process, and it's a process that a lot of people are familiar with. So everything we do involves a process. Now, if eBay had one huge, gigantic computer, these processes would take place on one computer. However, interoperability comes into play when you jump computer systems or organizations. So, for instance, what if eBay had to pass on some information to PayPal? PayPal is a separate operation. They have their own computers. So they have to come up with a way to handshake, to agree on when this happens at eBay, so-and-so will happen on PayPal. That's all interoperability. So it happens on a business process level, and it also happens on a system transaction level. Hey, PayPal says, hey, well, you send me this in this format, I'll expect it, and then do this with it. That's all interoperability. It operates on a technical level, on an information level, and on a business process level. Now, with the FAA in particular, if something goes wrong and there is an emergency with a particular flight and the Department of Defense needs to be notified, well, that's a really major interoperability thing. A signal has to be sent in some way, shape, or form, either mediated by a human in most cases or automatically. Or even if it's mediated by a human, something has to be initiated on a separate computer to start a whole other sequence of events, intervention, scrambling a jet, notification up and downstream with many other organizations, such as NORAD, such as other terminal radar areas, such as local law enforcement, such as you name it. So this all has to be blueprinted, mapped out, and that's where enterprise architecture comes in. You need some kind of blueprint to keep all of this together, and that's what Ptech was so good at.
Now, was there a reference to Ptech having operated in the basement out of the FAA?
Yes. Now, typically, because the scope of such projects are so overarching and wide-ranging, when you are doing an enterprise architecture project, you pretty much have access to how anything in the organization is being done, where it's being done, on what systems, what the information is, and you pretty much have carte blanche. Now, if it's a major project that spans several years, the team that comes in has literally access to almost anything that they want because you're operating on a blueprint level, on a massive scale. So, yes, they were everywhere, and I was told that they were in places that required clearances. I was told that they had log-on access to FAA flight control computers. I was told that they had passwords to many computers that you may not on the surface think has anything to do with finding out holes in the system. But let's say you said, okay, you isolated a part of a process, of a notification process that was mediated by a computer, and you wanted to investigate it further, then you would typically get log-on access to that computer. And from that, back upstream or downstream, so who knows? You know, from my own experience, I could have access to almost anything I wanted to in JP Morgan Chase. And didn't, for the reason if anything went wrong, I didn't want to have the access. But if you were up to no good as an enterprise architect with such a mandate, you typically could have anything you wanted. Access to anything.
What do you think of the claim by the so-called 9/11 Independent Commission and the testimony before it and their report? The intelligence agencies didn't know how to talk to each other. What did you think of their so-called report?
Completely flawed. Governor Kaine was the second choice for the head of the commission. I believe Henry Kissinger was the first. Governor Kaine had, oh, by the way, done business deals with BMI, Solomon Bahari, Ptech, none of which came out, which he should have volunteered and either recused himself as being ahead or have it out there in the open. There were 3 other members of the commission who had similar kinds of relationships in the past, and they were all on the team. But their findings were so flawed. They're using an excuse. Yes, there are interoperability communication issues in any organization. Yes, they are. But in the case of an emergency, it doesn't get that bollocksed up. Unless, of course, Rupert is right and Cheney was running interference somewhere, or someone was running interference, or whoever. You know, we don't know. But there were 4 war games, 4 simulations going on the morning of 9/11. And I just want people to remember that the whole nature of what MITRE, which is also, they developed software for intelligence, which includes the CIA, MITRE and Ptech, would have, if they were going to test whether they had fixed these holes, would have probably run a simulation. I don't know that they did, but that's how we do things. But there were 4 of them going on. So was there room for confusion? I don't think these people were stupid. I think they were deliberately confused, if anything.
Well, we know very well that there was a simulation of the very event taking place during the event,
yes.
Right?
Yes, there was. And I believe there's proof there was more than one, just in case the first one didn't confuse people enough. So what does this say? I can be very objective about this and say, well, the terrorists knew that there were war games scheduled for this day and they took advantage of it and called 9/11 the particular day. However, we do know that 9/11 had been selected prior. Okay, so then maybe the war games were set many weeks prior for 9/11. And you can play this game over and over and over. Yes, it was the perfect day. And yes, you needed inside knowledge. And yes, Ptech, with all its myriad associations, would have had the inside knowledge. And yes, Ptech was a CIA front. And yes, Ptech was protected. So was it an inside job? You don't have to look at this indirectly. This is direct. This requires direct investigation.
Well, that was what I was going to ask you about your investigation of Ptech. You have pretty much come up with evidence that, of course, Ptech was a CIA cutout or front or whatever.
That's correct. I had this validated to me by high-level people within. And in fact, during my investigation, when I was reaching out to the people that I had worked with, because remember, I did do work for a small company called the Interoperability Clearinghouse, or the ICH, and they were DARPA funded, and they weren't a DARPA company, they were DARPA funded. They got funding from many, many organizations, including Boeing and whatever, because they were providing a wonderful service, software. And we were seeking funding from Incutel, which was the IT-seeking arm of the CIA. Now, interestingly enough, the funding decision was supposed to come through on September 12th. I am not saying that it would have come through, but after 9/11, there was no funding coming through on 9/12. So subsequent to that, I was picking up the pieces and still remaining in contact with that group and trying to form another group and company while I was working at JP Morgan after 9/11, while we were going through the environmental nightmares that we were going through. I was still trying to pick up the pieces of that life to create a really good risk blueprint to prevent the kinds of things like 9/11 from happening to us. And I was pretty ignorant about a lot of this inside clandestine betrayals. What happened, I kept in touch with a lot of these people. When Ptech fell into my lap, I did reach out to them. I said, can you tell me if what I'm looking at is true, is real? How could it be real? And one of the people that I reached out to did work for the CIA, and he said he could not discuss front office operations. And I never knew what he meant by that. But anyway, subsequent to that, there were 2 or 3 points down the road that I had higher and higher level confirmation that it was being utilized. Eventually, I came across a report, actually the FBI Twin Towers investigative report, that the FBI had commissioned a private investigator to do on certain people, and in there, it was so clear that, I mean, even the presence of CARE International, whose roots were in Maktab al-Khidamat, that was glaring, and that they were all over every place in U.S. infrastructure. You do not get that without very high-level help, and that's what the vendors, the competitors of Ptech had said. Everyone knew. They were given carte blanche, open.
And this was a separate company in Washington, D.C. that you were doing some work with prior to September 11th.
Right.
That got some funding from DARPA.
Right. Interestingly enough, I did not let people know that it was Ptech until maybe August 2002, this ICH, the DARPA-funded group. No, we had pretty much moved on. And I accidentally let slip in August 2002 to one of my colleagues there that the company, the name of the company that was being investigated was Ptech. And she was horrified, because she said they're everywhere. And I said, yeah, fancy that. Wonder who put them there. They didn't get there by accident. Ptech came about in 1993, actually. They were reformed in 1993. That's when Yasin Qadi had invested in them.
What happened with the raid that the FBI staged on Ptech?
Well, what happened was, when I took all of this information back to JP Morgan, after Agent Wright had appeared on the steps of the Capitol, then I went down to Virginia. I got all the information together. I had the Ptech people actually write it out. So it wouldn't be Indira says, it would be, this is what they put together. And I had emails, documentation, photographs, the photographs that flew around the world that was plastered all over network TV. That's what I got from these people. And I interviewed a bunch of very scared people. What is going on? The FBI knows about it and they're doing nothing. What is going on? What do you think this tells you? And I didn't want to go there without proof. I wasn't going to go there. Really what I did, and the most powerful thing I think anyone can do, is not just to make an accusation or get a little bit of proof, which can be hushed up and denied, but I took what I had to everyone. Before Ptech was ever raided, before it ever became public, I took it all the way up to the top of the FBI. I took it everywhere. And the reality of the situation is proven by the response I got there. More telling than the actual deed itself. Their response to that is really what indicts them all.
What was their response?
Shut up and go away or you will be killed. Basically.
Now, you got that response from all different levels in government.
I got that response from J.P. Morgan. I got that response from Ptech. I got that warning from people within the FBI, mostly the FBI. See, when the Boston FBI sent me that tape that Joe Bergantino had run the story on, and I looked at the tape, and it was all Ptech people that, basically are affiliated with Ptech that they were looking for, I was really scared. And I contacted Joe Bergantino to tell him I've been threatened. People had been in my house. I'm a 9/11 survivor. I can't back down on this. And that if anything happens to me, the story that you did back in November 2001, did you know that these people worked at Ptech? He said, we had some suspicion we didn't know. And I said, well, let me tell you what Ptech does. When I went down there and I spoke to them in June 2002, they thought I had a flower pot growing out of my head. They didn't believe me at all. I said, you've done the original story. You just don't realize are connected to corporate America and the government in this way. So what they did is they initiated their own investigation. And their own investigation, they came back to me and said, we're sorry for having doubted you. It's not only as bad as you said, it's much, much worse. And they said,
this is the investigative reporter.
Right, their whole team. This is CBS, oh, by the way, and a CBS affiliate. So they had interviewed me and taped me, and this is now August 2002. They had said that we are going to run the story on the 1-year anniversary of 9/11, and I begged them, I was horrified, please do not delay, get it out now. And they said, no, it's not going to play well in August because everyone's on vacation. And I was banging my head against the wall, I was in tears, and I said, they're going to shut this down. People are going to talk, they're going to find out about it, and they're going to shut you down. And sure enough, they did. There were 7 networks that had caught wind of this story, and they shut down the investigation. Their excuse was that, hey, yeah, Ptech is everywhere we don't want him to be. All of a sudden, they said, you know what? We have to find out that if we do anything to them, what will they do with our infrastructure? Which was complete baloney because they had known all along. And they were, even as I spoke out at that time, they were being evaluated for use in Homeland Security.
You're talking about Ptech.
Ptech, yeah. So much for their trite little excuse about, oh yeah, gosh, we let this one slip through for like almost a year, but now that we're aware of it. See, and that's why in my making other people aware of it, they were aware of it at the highest levels all along. So they can't suddenly pull that and say, well, they could impact national security if we suddenly raid them. They were being evaluated for use in Homeland Security. So we knew it was a cover-up at that time. And I was very concerned that they weren't ever going to raid Ptech, that no one would ever know. This would never be made public. If I had spoken out about it, I could be sued. Where is your proof? You've told the government they've done nothing. You've told the FBI they've done nothing. I then embarked on my own campaign. I had written a report, and I had a pretty good email list of people in D.C. And I said, you know what? I'm going to send this report exposing Ptech and their connections to terrorism to 10 chief information officers, chief technology officers a week until Ptech is raided. And I began calling people. And I began sending things out. I began scheduling appointments and showing up. Instead of talking about enterprise architecture, I was talking about, well, what software do you use? And I watched more people's face turn absolutely white. I watched people almost get physically ill. And I watched them circle the wagons. And now I'm talking about major chemical companies, major energy companies, and the CIO, one of the CIOs of the Department of Defense, whose Pentagon meeting I interrupted to talk about Ptech. Yeah, the line went bad. But within a week after that, Ptech was raided, and Ari Fleischer said there's nothing wrong with the company. I watched my life go down the drain. But
so what about Ptech now? I mean,
they renamed. Yeah, they I apologize. They're still in use.
They're still going?
Absolutely, but they've renamed themselves. They're called Go Agile, and they're still going. When we try to find out what the status of the investigation is, we've been told alternatively that they've been cleared or it's still in limbo. Nothing definitive has been done. Solomon Bahari had been arrested, minor slap on the wrist.
And what kind of a response did you get from J.P. Morgan Chase, your employers at the time, when you went to them with what you had found out about Ptech?
Well, they had told me that I should be killed for getting all this evidence. I was intimidated. I wrote a letter to my boss saying that I had been intimidated, and the person who intimidated me, the third highest ranking person in the bank, the general auditor, had said this has gone all the way up to the top, that they were very aware of it, and that they were going to explicitly deny Ptech being used at J.P. Morgan Chase. In fact, they would even explicitly deny the URL to the website so that no one could even look into them. Of course, now the name has changed, so we wonder what's going on there. But when he asked me, where did you get this from and that from, I was basically thoroughly intimidated. They treated me as though I was a bad guy. That's what happened. They treated me as though I was a bad guy for having dug up all of this stuff.
And you were told by the chief auditor at J.P. Morgan Chase that the different individuals that you had gotten this information from should have been killed?
Yeah. And you have to remember that I pointed to down the street, I said, I lost people there. And he said, I lost people there too. Look, this is about 9/11. I put it in a folder labeled 9/11. And it got pretty ugly from that point on. Basically, he said that if he needed to be sure that I would never mention Ptech again. And I said, here's a problem. I'm a senior consultant. I consult with a lot of people. You may deny Ptech business here. What happens to Citibank? What happens to Goldman Sachs? What happens to the rest? He said, that's not my problem. And I said, that's why we have that hole in the ground up the street. It is everyone's problem. In fact, Director Mueller of the FBI said that preventing terrorism was everyone's problem. So, I'm just going along with an FBI directive to the general population. And so I had written a letter to Wilson Lowry, who at that time was his right-hand administrative person, who was an ex-CEO of IBM, Wilson Lowry. Wilson Lowry turned out to be the one who came down hard on Colleen Rowley for being a whistleblower. So, guess what his politics were on Ptech.
As a senior consultant with J.P. Morgan Chase, were you on a consulting contract or were you an employee?
No, I was on a consulting contract. However, I had a 10-year relationship with them. I was given tasks there that were not given to employees, to even trusted employees. I was given responsibilities way above and beyond a lot of other employees. I was given pretty much carte blanche to think out of the box and do things, and I was funded out of a strategic fund called Lab Morgan, where they experimented with new ideas. So I had a lot of latitude, and the people I reported to were on the board of directors and a very senior level. They trusted me, keeping their best interests at heart. I think exactly my behavior around at Ptech was entirely predictable and in line with someone who held a light for risk and integrity in business dealings. In fact, one of the colleagues said, of all the people whose lap this would fall into, you're about the only one with enough latitude to not look the other way.
And so then what happened? Was your contract canceled?
Summarily terminated.
You were?
Yeah.
And when did that happen?
June 28th, 2002.
And you stayed on in New York City then through 2004?
Right. I stayed on in the same apartment. I reached out to friends of mine in the FBI who I asked them what was going on. I got pretty close with one of them who understood who was on the counterterrorism team, the Northeast, and was part of the A-team, so to speak. And he looked at what I was looking at. I passed a lot of my information through him, and I said, am I crazy? Please tell me that I'm crazy. I'd rather be crazy than this be true. And he said, nope, and it is worse than you think. So he validated a lot of things. He could not break any rules, and I wouldn't let him because he was my friend. But he helped me see and interpret things So one of the most powerful things I could have done was to push this through the system and see how the system responded. And it's the system's response that indicts them in the end, just as the system's response to the EPA, to the environmental disaster in Lower Manhattan, indicts them. If this were a true terrorist attack, you would have been seeing pictures of our lungs all over national TV for years to come. Metaphorically, that sort of thing. You never saw what it was really like. So basically, after I got thrown out of JP Morgan, my attitude was, as soon as everyone knows what Ptech really is and they understand that it was for real, all will be forgiven and I will be back in business. And that sure didn't happen. And I'm not sure even at this stage whether I want to be involved with anything to do with corporate America or the government, because look at what's happening. I'm looking at the people that are being put in place, like Negroponte, director of Intel. I'm hearing the inside response to that. I know where he comes from, what his pedigree is politically, and one by one, we're seeing the handwriting on the wall, and most people are looking for exit strategies. You might say leave the country, go to France, go to Canada, but there are no exit strategies for this. All of this stuff took money to fund, and it was funded through major financial crimes, money laundering, and looting. We call it looting of the S&Ls, looting of the banking system, and what we're in the middle of now, which is the looting of Social Security. And this is all being done, the looting of HUD, it's all being done systematically to keep the slush funds up for the game at play.
Where do you think this is headed?
Not any place good for people. And it isn't just going to be America, it is going to be global.
Well, Indira Singh, thank you very much.
Thank you, Bonnie.